Hello. Hi. Hi. So, trying to, this is Amandine from Montreal. I'm trying to help you with the over concern. Before. Okay. The whole music playing. Do you want to start it back again and see if that goes away? Hi.
Yeah. Hey, Halifax.
I'm frozen. You're frozen too.
Brianne, how do you sit motionless like that? That was great. Amber.
Hey, Amber, are you still there?
Nope.
Yep, I'm still here, but I can't see you.
No, I'm not here.
I can't see you. Okay, I'm going to hang up and then call you right back.
Okay.
So I want
and you have someone, as in Ryan, that just closed, that deal last week, right? And my last deal I closed was maybe a couple of years ago. So he is fresh. He is one of the market leaders in the industrial market in Montreal, Quebec, in terms of respect in the industry from landlords, in terms of his clients looking up to him and calling him for ideas. And just in terms of market share between him and his partner, Dieudonné, I'd say, they can have at least a good 30–40% market share to themselves. So we are very fortunate to have Ryan part of us here today. We've decided to ask Ryan, since we only have 60 minutes, to take a short offer to purchase as an example versus a long version. I mean, as we've discussed, during the offer to leases, when you're dealing with offers, it could be 3 pages, like it could be 60 pages, depending on the needs. So this is going to be a 4 or 5 pager. Hopefully we can go through it pretty quickly, but at least it's going to be clear, and hopefully we'll answer most of all of your questions. So very quickly, Ryan's been in the industry for over 15 years, and just last 20 months has closed for over $250 million worth of deal volume. Again, thank you for accepting our invitation, Ryan. I really appreciate it. Over to you, and if you guys have questions, any offices, Ryan encourages you to interrupt him at any given point in time. Over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. We have Halifax, Ottawa, London.
Correct.
Good morning. Could you see the screen with the offer to purchase?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. I'm going to walk you through an offer to purchase, which, in Quebec, and I don't know how it is in the other provinces, but we have a real estate organization called the OSIC, which has their own templates and forms. Commercial brokers typically, the CBREs, the Colliers, the Cushmans, use their own proprietary offer lease form or offer to purchase forms, whereas the offices of this world typically use the designated forms. So we're not going to talk about the designated forms that are used amongst the residential agents. However, there are a lot of elements that every offer requires. So you'll see it in our offer, and you'll see it as well in standard form that is admitted by the OS6. And the reason why I'm just bringing that up is because I'm not sure how it is in Ontario. I've done some transactions there, and I know I've seen those standard forms actually utilized. However, I believe most brokerage firms use their own legal template, and every broker has their own version, own form. There are critical elements that the laws in Quebec particularly require you to identify certain items, and I'll walk you through it, but it's very standard. Obviously, who's the purchaser, you have to describe who he is, who's the vendor, price, conditions, closing date. So I'll walk you through all that and, you know, warranties and whatnot, and that's very standard. So I'll take through the document. It's a short form, offer to purchase I've used multiple times. Typically, I use this on the owner-occupier purchase where I'm representing the buyer. They don't typically have their own template unless it's an investment sale of some variety where there's a law firm who is then issuing a purchase and sale agreement, which is more what Avi was talking about, a 60-page document. So you'll hear those the PSA, purchase and sale agreement, or APS, agreement purchase and sale. These are typically investment sales where the vendor's actually providing you their standard form of purchase and sale agreement. Today is really more on the occupier side where I'm representing a buyer. So we use a fairly straightforward template through it, and you know I'm not going to read every word, but essentially I've highlighted all the points that need to be filled out, and obviously the template could be adapted accordingly. But if we start from the top, we need to talk who the purchaser is, and I'd like to see wording and/or nominee or company to be formed. So what does that mean? Or nominee or company to be formed. Typically what happens is an owner-occupier called Walmart wants to offer, so you'll put Walmart Inc. But prior to closing, their accountant or somebody may step in and say, you know what, why don't you buy it in a holdco, and kind of shield the real estate from the operating business. So typically I want to show the vendor who's actually initiating an offer, but in reality, it may change prior to closing, and that's what and/or nominee or company to be formed provides you. Questions on that? So then identify the purchaser is offering to purchase through CBRE Limited, represented by myself, and I define CBRE in quotations, from the owner of the property, so you input the vendor's name. Now talk about for the price and subject to the terms and conditions set forth, and you describe the property. So you need to put in the address, locality, the province, and in Quebec we have renovated lot numbers. So the lot number is the legal description of the property. I'm not sure what it is in the other provinces, but we use a lot number, which really defines the legal measurement of the property, and you put the size of the land. The building size is not really in the sale because you're buying the entire property, which you is finite from the law. And in fact, go ahead.
Brian, sorry, it's Sean in Ottawa. I'm a little slow on my question with regard. I just step back to the and/or nominee question. If you are a vendor, do you care if the purchaser has the and/or nominee language in? And more so as it pertains to potential default on a purchase. If you're a holdco, you got really nothing to go after, whereas if you're the parent company, you do have assets to go after in the event of a default.
Excellent question. So we're going to flip to page 3, item 10, and it ties right into that, and it answers your question. So sometimes a transfer, an assignment, and you know you can flip your offer, you can send it to another company, and as a vendor, you don't want to lose, you know, the covenant of Walmart Inc. in the offer. You don't want them to flip your offer, or you don't want them to not have liability with a deposit or default. So what I do, and my offer is very neutral, by the way. It's not a buyer offer, it's not a seller offer. I try and bring it in the middle. So I structured this template and Clause 10 is an assignment and transfer. So what it says is, and this goes right in point to the nominee or company to be formed, it says, the purchaser shall have the right to assign and transfer his rights and obligations to a third party, provided that the purchaser, who is Walmart Inc., will be liable for all its obligations as stated in the offer, notwithstanding any assignment up until the transfer and the closing, at which time he will be released. So the person making the offer, Walmart Inc., is responsible for this document all the way up until the closing. After that, there's liability. And this offer, which it will tie into the warranties and the as-is-where-is nature of the offer. But the purchaser itself is bound to all the obligations, which is the Walmart Inc., up until the closing. So it's neutral, it's fair. You don't always see this language. People sometimes just say, no, I can transfer to whoever I want and I have no recourse. I would always push on that point. But I see people attempt to slip it in that way. So this protects the vendor. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, actually, that's I really like that answer. Thank you very much.
Okay. Like I said, it's neutral, so you can play it on both sides.
For this building, elevators has Rob signed.
Okay. So I was at the legal description of a property. So in Quebec, we utilize.
Can you hear us? Sophie, can you hear us? It went to the Kinner office. For some reason, the screen is not keeping up with the conversation. We're
To Section 2, which describes when closing takes place. So we identify in this offer that the signing of the deed of sale will be executed before the purchaser's notary. So in the other provinces, I guess the purchaser's lawyer. This is fairly standard that it's the purchaser's side that's doing. However, it's not a requirement. Sometimes it could be vendor's notary, and a notary, just so you know, is supposed to act for both parties. He's supposed to be independent. He's supposed to be giving legal advice to either. He's a neutral party. You don't always feel that way sometimes at the closings, but that's just the nature of the business. Nevertheless, you need to identify when the closing will take place. So in this instance, we put 60 days following waiver of all conditions in this offer, which I will walk you through the conditions that this buyer had put in, which is Section 4. The cost of the deed of sale and its registration is typically paid by the purchaser.
Is 60 days a standard, or could it?
It's a little long, 60 days. In my world, you typically want to see 15 to 30 days upon moving. In some larger transactions, it could be longer. There's no real general rule. Also, are instances where, let's say, an owner-occupier purchase, but the vendor is an occupier of building, and he's got machinery and equipment. He'd say, well, you know what? I'm not moving out of my building until you waive all your conditions. You put up potentially a second deposit upon of your condition. I didn't put it here, but you have seen time where there's a second deposit because there's a delayed closing, and that the vendor has risk because he needs to move out prior to closing. If he has to move production equipment and whatnot, he'll want a longer closing. Maybe it's 3 or 6 months, but he'll only start his move once the purchaser goes firm on the transaction, meaning he's waived all conditions, and deposits now, whether it's 1 or 2 deposits, have become non-refundable. So there's skin in the game, there is recourse, and we have seen delayed closings for that reason.
Could it be as well, when we see longer longer than 60 days, could it be that someone's actually trying to flip the actual asset, and it's, how do we give red flags to the people on the table here that are listening?
So flips is something you hear of in the residential world, you see it on TV. Honestly, I haven't seen it happen very often. Typically a flip will happen post-closing. So what it means is the person actually has purchased the property, and then 6 months later, he flips the real estate. I've rarely seen paper flip pre-closing. I'm sure it's happened, but in terms of identifying red flags, yes. A late closing for no reason would be a red flag. No deposit would be a red flag. But if it's because the vendor needs time to vacate the building, or the purchaser's lease is up for whatever reason in 12 months and he's asked for a delayed closing and it works for both parties, there needs some backstory and good faith on both sides, but there are definitely red flags to look at if there's a long closing or a low deposit.
Peter, here in Ontario, there's a requirement of a specific date rather than a rounded date of approximately 60 days or 30 or 45. Our agreements require a specific closing date. So
I actually prefer that. A lot of times I put the date. However, a lot of people like counting days in Quebec and going vague and gray and start arguing about days. But I prefer, yes, I prefer a finite date as well, and you can certainly input a finite date. One thing to note that because we use a notary in Quebec, the purchaser 90% of the time is paying for the cost of the deed of sale. It's just standard practice. However, the vendor still will have to pay for any legal work that's done on his side, such as radiating a mortgage. That would still be a cost that the vendor has to absorb, and their legal work. But just the actual deed of sale is paid by the purchaser. Any questions there?
Alex, I think you have...
Oh, yeah, Alex. Okay. So, question 3. This is a...
Hang on, Ottawa's got a question.
Hey, Ryan, it's Matt Chappell from Ottawa. I as well do industrial with my father, Ian. So we actually just sold a building, and I was located in an area that a few gas stations were adjacent to the property.
Sure.
Quick question. Do you typically tell the seller, if you have that list, the listing, to do an environmental phase 1 or 2 prior to selling, or do you do it once you have a firm offer?
Always advise a vendor, in any instance really, to control the information. So what does that mean? It means file prior to sale. If there's any worry about environmental, it's better to engage your own consultants, spend a few bucks, mitigate the risk, understand what the problem is, and disclose it prior. A lot of professional buyers and sharks and developers who will engage their own people nevertheless with relationships and then try and create a bit of a problem that doesn't necessarily exist or elevate it. So they recommend it, especially on an environmental side, to have it. Some vendors also have the attitude, well, if it's not broken, don't fix it. I don't want to spend the money. I don't want to create problems. Well, it's a bit of a risk, but it's always better to know what you're selling prior and to close it up front. This way, it's harder for the purchaser to come up with problems, and it just will expedite the transaction. And it's the same for even a building inspection, roof report, preparing a updated certificate of location which describes the property, which I think you guys call an ALTA survey maybe. I'm not sure what you call it, but a description. So whatever information you have up front is always recommended from a broker to recommend to his vendor.
Yeah.
Fair enough? So this actually goes right in point with your next question, which is document section. So the acceptance of the offer, and you can put a time delay on this, as well as a time delay going back to the deposit. You can say the deposit needs to be delivered by certain dates. Similar to Peter's question, you put a finite date. Things are all adaptable. I don't think so. I just make it, it's an obligation and it has to be done. And if you don't do it, well, then we'll get lawyers involved. But let's just cut the crap and move on. Give a deposit. I'm going to give you documents. Start the clock. So we put to section 3. The purchaser is asking upon the vendor to disclose the following: copy existing certificate of location, any leases, any environmental soil inspection reports, plans, taxes, utility bills, contracts related to the property, any notices of nonconformity and pending litigation. And I just put that clause in for this exercise because I just had a deal where there had litigation. He didn't disclose it up front. He disclosed it kind of at the 11th hour of my due diligence. It's a massive problem. An institutional seller, they have to sell the property. There was a warranty saying they have to sell it free of litigation, but it didn't say they had to disclose it. So they withheld it, and it had material impact because there's an issue related to the neighbor and the parking lot servicing the property. The snow was melting on the neighbor's property, and they wanted a servitude and drainage, and it was a significant material impact, and the vendor did not disclose until the 11th hour. Nevertheless, we had to come up with an indemnity that the vendor had to resolve the litigation. So now asking for the vendor to disclose it on top of warranting he'll sell it without litigation, but now you need to provide me any notices of nonconformity, which would be from a municipal city, the building's not in conformity, fire code, whatever notices, as well as any litigation. So this is something that I've incorporated into the offer. And title deeds, just to opinion on the property, the previous deed of sale, and whatnot. This is a bit tricky because sometimes the vendor will have the information, they won't give it to you all at the same time. So it's important to ask the questions, but it is hard to know you're getting everything. So it's really important from a due diligence standpoint to hire good consultants and do your own studies nevertheless. Due diligence. So this is probably the most critical part of the offer. Section 4, Amadine, okay, you're there. So the purchaser typically in Quebec for an owner-occupier purchase will have a delay 30, 60 days, somewhere around that. It means that the purchaser is not certain on what he's buying, i.e. maybe needs a zoning change, maybe there's a board approval, but if you're presenting an owner-occupier or a vendor, 30, 60 days is really enough time to satisfy all your conditions, which would be the following: physical inspection, inspector, perform soil tests if required. Maybe the vendor gave you an updated phase 1 that's 6 months old, the banks approved it, well, then you might not have to do that. Verify zoning, occupancy permits, whatnot. Verify title. Title means are any liens on the property, any contractors put a lien on the building, litigation, expropriation, financing, mortgage, anything. It will appear on title. In Quebec, we have a land registry, which any lawyer, notary, or even broker could get $1. You can pull title of the building, and you'll see the full Rolodex of the history of that property dating back like 100 years. And you'll see if there's any leases registered, anything will be on there. So that is part of your diligence. You have the right to obtain financing. And I always put in satisfy the feasibility of their future projects. So that's a very blanket term. That it basically means if you're not satisfied with your due diligence for pretty much any reason, you can walk away. So it is an option. It is not a fight. Get your financing, if the inspection passes, that you must proceed. This is a discretionary due diligence. This is typical of commercial real estate. Residential, specifically in Quebec, it is a lot more finite, meaning you'll have 10 days to do an inspection, and you'll have to determine also in your offer, if you're going for financing, what are the terms that you need to get. It's harder to get out of an offer in Quebec, because if the inspection comes back and you get your financing, there's no real excuse to cancel on cold feet.
Mm-hmm. So, and I know it's 9:30 already, so I'll be very quick, but it's important. So when you represent the purchaser, and initially when you started explaining this offer, you said, I like this to be a win-win situation, right? So when we represent the purchaser, we obviously want the due diligence clause to have an easy out for any given reason, right? When we're representing the vendor, then obviously you want it to be as tight, controlled as possible. Today compared to 10 years ago, do you see vendors accepting offers and having due diligence clauses that say you can really opt out for any given reason?
In commercial, yes, especially if there's another broker on the other side. Now, you're dealing with an older vendor who's old school, you solicited him, hotter market, so you are seeing actual people coming in with varied conditions or no conditions whatsoever. They'll just put an unsolicited offer, no conditions, here's the deposit, let's go to closing. So you are seeing that, but this language is typically accepted. They may ask for proof of financing, especially if the guy you're not about the other broker, you could say, well, does the guy have a pre-approval? Could you send a letter? And you'll see that again in residential. However, in commercial, it's a business-to-business transaction, not asking for an abundant amount of time. 30, 60 days goes very quickly. So it is essentially an option. It's a discretionary due diligence, which I will walk you through.
But why would you still think it's important for your purchaser to give a deposit, secure deposit, if really the thing is that they can pull the plug at any given point in time and have to give back and receive their deposit if it doesn't go through?
Again, it's a sign of good faith. It shows that the guy is credible, and that's why the deposit, I think, is even more important in Quebec, because if you're putting up a $3 million offer and you say, I'm going to put $10,000 in a bank account and freeze it for 60 days, they can't have much skin in the game. Even if it's refundable, it's not a nuisance on him. $100,000, you know, you still have a legal contract. He still has to meet certain obligations. Obviously, he can opt out at any point during his due diligence. But again, there's still $100,000 up there. I don't want to fight for that to return back. So the way the diligence would run then is, should the purchaser, this is the last clause on the first page, should the purchaser be unsatisfied for any reason, he at his sole and only discretion can cancel this offer in the period, and the deposit will be returned to the purchaser without any further obligation on either party. Thus, the nature of really an option. If he fails to send him notice within the mentioned delay, the purchaser then is deemed to be satisfied with his inspection. Oh, sorry. It could go either way, just so you know. You can write it however you want. But if he failed to send the notice, the purchaser is satisfied with the results of his inspection, then he is deemed unsatisfied. So what does that mean? It means he must waive his due diligence. Prior to the end of that delay, he needs to send a notice to the vendor or his broker saying, I am satisfied, I waived. So what does that mean? It means now the deposit is firm, the deal is firm, and we have a contract. Now there is recourse, there is liability. The argument is over. The clause actually says, in the event that the purchaser doesn't show up to the closing and the vendor wasn't in default, that the deposit will be paid to the vendor as liquidated damages and no further recourse to the party. So this is language that I typically use. We see it among many offers. Sometimes people don't limit the damages to the deposit. They'll say, no, I want also to have the right to sue you over and above that. But again, I told you this is a neutral offer. This is acceptable. So it's really, the deposit is all that is at stake. Any differences in the other provinces? No? Okay. Now adjustments. So typically on an owner-occupier and there's no leases, the adjustments are quite simple. You just make the adjustments as of the signing of the deed of sale. Real estate taxes, utilities, whatever, there will be limited adjustments. Now if there is a lease back or with the vendor or any leases in place, then you have to make the necessary adjustments. This is done by the lawyers and the notaries, but you identify what adjustments are being made. Section 6 is the most important of the warranties of an offer. So this is the vendor representing warranting to the purchaser the following statements are true as of the signing of the offer and as well as of the closing date. What does this mean? It says the vendor will provide you good and marketable title, free and clear of all HIPs, which is a mortgage, servitudes, reserves of any nature, anything set forth, public utilities, provided that they do not affect the marketability of the property. So actually the vendor is saying, I'm selling you a marketable property, free and clear of any issues on title, mortgages, liens, whatever. The word marketability of the property, I don't know if this is a Quebec thing, but we see this word a lot. Any of you guys learned about that? No? And it's language, you just want to understand that you are something that is marketable, meaning you can buy it, you can sell it, it's clean. The next statement, that the vendor has no knowledge and has not received any notices of nonconformity or noncompliance from any municipal or governmental authority. There are no legal proceedings pending or written threats of litigation relates to the property. So back to my previous example and point, you want to know that the vendor has warranted these items and that at any time between your offer and the closing, that this statement is true. Now, if something does arise, all this means is the vendor has to provide you notice and you deal with it accordingly. Secondly, that between the acceptance of the offer and the closing date, that the property will remain in the same condition and repair, except for obviously reasonable wear and tear. So if there's major damage to the property, or there's a fire, there's lightning, or whatever, then clause E actually steps in, which I will get to very, very quickly. But D, the reason I highlighted it, it's an occupier sale, the vacant possession of the property upon closing free of any leases. This certainly be adapted in the event there are leases, if there's lease back, if the vendor's staying in a building, but this 90% of the time you're buying a vacant building from an occupier. C ties into C. So in the event there is damage to the property, I define material damage. Some people don't define it, and it's up to then the lawyers and the courts to determine, you know, what it is. However, I like to make it crystal clear. Material damage is deemed to be anything over $100,000 in damage caused to the property. So if the building has a fire and the damage is north of $100,000, what does it mean? It means the purchaser, at his sole discretion, could cancel the offer and his deposit back, and no one has any further recourse. If the damage is less than $100,000, it means the purchaser can't get out of the deal. It means you have to deal with it. The insurance proceeds, the vendor has to fix it, but it doesn't give them the unilateral right to cancel. Obviously, the parties have to come together and figure out a solution. This protects the buyer in the sense that if there's major damage to the property and he doesn't want to wait for the building to be rebuilt, he doesn't wait, he can walk away. But if it's under $100,000, which on $1 million or $5 million, it's not a huge item, it shouldn't stop the purchaser from going with the deal. The clause which I use, which is a very strong statement, but it's what typical vendors want to see, but I put it in because I explained to buyers, you're not going to get any warranties. You're buying the building as is, where is. So this statement says that I'm buying the building without any warranty, legal or contractual, and the purchaser is taking the property at his own risk and perils in the present state and condition on an as-is, where-is basis. This is out of the Quebec Civil Code or jurisprudence. This is right out of Quebec, where there's been laws stating you need to have these specific at its own risk and perils. I'm not sure if that's how it is in Ontario or in the Maritimes, but this is what you need to protect the vendor in the sense that he is selling it as is, where is. And when you put in the word no warranty, it relates to the title of the property. So there's no comeback after the sale. This also protects the vendor from latent defects. If there is a latent defect that is discovered, say 2 years, 3 years, there is recourse for the buyer against the vendor unless something is fraudulent. If there was a latent defect and it's fraud, you go in front of a judge and said the guy didn't disclose something, he withheld a report, he did something, I think the judge will rule in your favor. But this does protect from latent defects and any recourse after a closing, except the warranties he made. So, for example, he made a warranty that he didn't receive any expropriation or notices of non-compliance. Well, that's still valid. He's not protected by this clause because he did warrant certain elements. So it's kind of a one goes the other, but there are items that he still has to warrant. And this is case, but this is the general nature of a commercial transaction. Now, there are warranties sometimes to title. There are other warranties that could be made towards environmental, especially if the vendor is, call it shell gas. They'll ask you to buy it as is, but they may make a warranty because they legally have to own the environmental contamination for a certain period or time. And you've got to have warranties extend for a year, 2, 5 years, 10 years. There's many ways to draft this. This is obviously the simplest and cleanest for parties, but each circumstance is different, and this is endless. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, some situations, if you're going to ask for a loan to eventually purchase the asset, you won't get it if the asset is contaminated. So if you are buying from a shell of this world, good luck, right? Because these remediation take years and millions of dollars, and a lot of time it actually costs more than the actual asset. And some people, I've sold some shell big lots where the les raffineries, how do you say? Refineries. And the asset was worth about 10 million, but decontaminate was about 70 million. So we sold it for $1, and the purchaser eventually did it on his own because there was such potential for the land. So you have to watch out, right? Because they have to be done most of the time prior to the actual transaction being completed for you kids to get some financing. So those are little things to take into consideration. The next clause is the most important for us.
It is, and this is also a bit discretionary. So, and you're representing a purchaser, it's not really his duty to define what the commission percentage is for. However, 99% of the time, I ask the co-broker or lender what the commission is, and I like to put it into the document. Other times, people have a separate commission agreement, and this clause will just say, as per separate agreement between the broker and the vendor. However, I like to have everything in one spot. It doesn't always read this way. It could read as per separate agreement, but I like to have it up front. And sometimes I'm making offers unsolicited. I like to tell the vendor what my expectations are in the event you're not open and willing to pay my fee. It's stronger to put an offer from a credible purchaser. So you can negotiate this point down, but there is wording in this clause is extremely important, whether it's in offer or in your commission agreement.
Right. Is there happen very often where the vendor says, I don't want to pay your commission, you guys get paid by the purchaser?
That happens once or twice a year, and I will get paid by the buyer. I'll have a separate agreement, and this clause will just say, as per separate agreement, buyer's paying the commission. It happens. I try to avoid it to the nth degree, and the reason is, and I'll walk you through the clause, this is the purchaser declares that this offer was presented to the vendor through services CBRE, which was defined as CB Limited, represented by myself. And it's very critical that you say at the closing, the agrees to pay a commission of, call it 5% of the purchase price plus the taxes, and the word irrevocable. That's a key word in Quebec. I'm not sure if it's the same in other provinces, but irrevocable means that he has to instruct the acting notary to pay directly from the proceeds of the sale. This protects your commission. It doesn't mean I'll pay after. This means that you irrevocably instruct the notary to pay that commission from the proceeds of that sale.
Lawyer can't avoid paying.
Sorry?
Were you saying something?
Oh, no, sorry, just having a conversation with our guys here. I thought we were on mute. Pardon me. We've had some technical problems, but we got up.
Wardrobe malfunction.
That's it.
So irrevocable is very important. You need that word there. If it's not irrevocable, you're not 100% instructing him. It's like, it's a very important word. Of the essence, it's basically legal mumbo jumbo that we see in most offers. It just says that you need to respect the delays, essentially.
Is that critical? Is that something that's actually?
I'm not sure. I took my course 15 years ago, so the details are fuzzy. Obviously, leave it. It doesn't have any material impact, but I think it does mean something in Quebec to say time is of the essence. But Section 9 income tax, so it just says the vendor represents at the time of the deed of sale that he will be a non-resident. You're just essentially whether he's a resident or not, and what's the word? Conformity with the tax code. Section 10, which we discussed, but you guys...
And Peter here.
Yeah.
On the income tax issue,
Yeah.
the reason for that being there is that if they said, no, I am not a resident of Canada, then there would have to be withholding tax held by the lawyer at closing. Otherwise, the purchaser could be liable for those taxes if there are any owing. So
there you go. So quite an important statement. I guess the onus is on the purchaser, is what Peter is saying.
Onus on the vendor to confirm. If he doesn't confirm, then onus falls to the purchaser to withhold it.
Okay.
I have something to say. Hear you, Ottawa, just because we received an email from you guys saying you had a question, but we can't hear you.
Okay. So Section 10 we discussed, but now you can actually see the wording up on the board. The purchaser has the right to transfer all his rights to any third party designated by the purchaser, provided he remains liable up until the closing, at which point he would be relieved of his obligations.
You guys hear us now?
Yeah.
You got a big
Sounds like
room.
they're wrestling the microphone in Ottawa.
Yeah.
The small Ottawa problem.
Just a few steps back to E here, where it's the property shall remain the vendor, closing date the $100,000.
Yep.
Question is, so if you're the agent and I'm the buyer and you show me the property and the drive-in doors, let's say example, are all perfectly up and running, I'm like, I want to buy this, I sign up, I give you the deposit, and then it's conditional for, 60 days until, remaining going through the clauses. Now, we said, I'm a little bit confused with the $100,000. If I move in and I notice that there's over $100,000 worth of damage, is that what you're kind of talking about, or is it just more generic?
It's between acceptance of the offer until the closing. That's the period of time it covers. There's material damage. So, destruction, fire, water, whatnot.
Right. Okay, that makes sense.
Doors, that goes towards Section 6C. And again, it only relates to the time period between acceptance and the closing. So those drive-in doors would be in the same condition up until the closing, subject to reasonable wear and tear. Now, if the door was destroyed, well then, prior to closing, the onus is on the purchaser to tell the vendor. Or if you don't catch it, well then the vendor's an ass, and tough. You bought it as is, where is, and it's on you to prove that that was destroyed prior to closing. Why didn't you say anything? So once you close, I have seen buyers want to go back to the property the day of closing just to scan around, but that protection there for the buyer.
So there's another question this is from Andrew from Halifax, because we can't hear them. Do you recommend inserting a threshold for material damage in 6E?
Yeah.
So it's black and white between the two parties. How often do you see this?
So I put a threshold, but maybe Andrew could explain what he means in terms of thresholds. Because we put a cap.
Okay. Well, in the meantime that Andrew gets back to us.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Yeah, all you have to do is unmute.
Holding up the microphone here. So, in terms of threshold, do you recommend inserting an actual number, like in this case, is 100,000 versus just leaving it as material damage and not attaching a specific dollar amount, just again to avoid any issuing the two parties?
Yeah, I use a number, but there's many times I just leave it material damage, and that wording, especially in Quebec, if you go in front of a judge and the parties don't close, this thing goes to court 2 years later, and the buyer's saying, hey, I don't want to buy this, but the vendor's suing him because he didn't close because of damage. So you're going to go in front of the judge and you're going to say, well, the door broke and the building was by a truck and some of the brick fell off. Is it going to buyer walk for that? Common sense, right? No, you could fix that very easily. But if there was a fire in the building, there's ash everywhere, the building stinks, I think that would be considered material damage. And leave the word blank or leaving the amount out, that's the scenario. Still be a pissing contest because you can say, well, the damage is only 50 and he's saying the damage is 200. There's got to be common sense, but at least having some threshold, it's clear that a door and some brick damage is not $100,000. Go ahead.
Is it typical that by the closing date, the tenant has moved out?
It's a tenant, so let's say buying an investment property or a multi-tenant property, and the owner-occupier wants to use one unit, well, then the tenants could remain. If it's a single-tenant building, and the purchaser wants to occupy it, and it's being sold by the vendor who happened to be a previous occupant, then typically there'd be a vacant possession. But I've done deals where the vendor stayed on for 6 months post-closing, and we did a short-term, say, a leaseback or a partial. He's downsized in the building, there's already a division, he's in, and it's all circumstantial.
If it closes, and let's say a trucker backs into the structure of the building, dents it.
Post-closing, you're saying?
Post-closing,
yeah.
Then you would have an issue.
Well, it's the new buyer's problem to deal with.
Okay.
And then if it was his tenant who happened to be previous vendor, well, there's a lease in place, and the lease would protect the new buyer from, tenant has to fix any damages, right? You do have to sign a lease.
Okay.
It's called a lease back. So you would do it at the closing, and we do that all the time.
Okay. Thank you.
Est-ce que c'est possible de mettre une clause à ce point-là, ou est-ce que c'est le vendor qui va avoir à payer pour les dommages pendant la période offer?
Yes, I've seen.
So repeat the question in English, please. All right. So
I think the question was, is there a way to get a clause for the vendor to pay for any damage? So there's other ways to write these clauses. I've seen many different variations. The vendor sometimes has the right to remedy. He has the right to even rebuild. Like, I've seen all sorts of clauses, but one wants to wait 2 years for insurance proceeds to grant it to the vendor, then for him to rebuild. I have seen that wording. To me, it doesn't make sense. There also is wording where the purchaser has the right, it's an option, to say, you know what, I'll buy the building with the fire. No problem. I collect the purchaser the insurance proceeds. The vendor will transfer the proceeds. There's many ways to write this. I like to keep it black, white, simple. I don't want to start with, the buyer wants to get paid, the buyer wants to buy the building. All the what-ifs could always be dealt with later. Mm-hmm. The parties could come together and agree, you know what, I'll wait. I'll take those insurance proceeds. But to have it in the offer day one, I find it's complicated. It's my style. I do see people asking for insurance proceeds for damage in day one offers. I remove that stuff. I think it's just overkill.
Ryan,
there's not much.
No, I know, and it's fine. It's very interesting. We have 7 minutes, but the next one, which is notice.
Sure.
So generation, and it could be on the brokerage side, it could be on the client side. Once upon a time, to come and bring the offers or any documentation, and we insisted to go and bring it to the actual client face to face and to go over the offers and go clause by clause. Just exactly what you're doing here today. That's what we would do with both parties separately to make sure everybody understands the ins and outs. Fast forward with time, obviously people want this via email, no explanation. They'll go on their own and they'll get back to us. You recommend, because time is money, obviously, but this is, usually a couple $100,000 commission every time you do a deal, which is $3 million going upwards. do you take the time, bring the offers, sit down with clients instead of sending things via email, fax, or whatever?
So, and this relates to general business, and I think that's where Abby is going. It's always better to be in front of the client, the buyer. You know, if someone calls you looking for space, go meet them first instead of just sending the market survey. I find I have a very low success rate doing it. It's the lazy way. Go meet the guy, let him get familiar with you. Same with an offer to purchase, present it to the party that you're representing, whether you're representing the buyer, go through it with him, or the vendor, go through it with him. Always better face-to-face. Regarding the notice section, you need to identify the parties and what are the mechanisms. So in here, you can send a notice by email, fax, certified mail, messenger. The clause, actually, I've seen people that the notice, if it's sent by email or fax, sometimes it's valid the next business day. I don't go there a day to day. I don't want to count. You get it by email, you got it that day. There are some brokers that like to play games and add a few more days. To Peter's point, he doesn't like to count, he likes a finite date. So here, when a notice is sent, it's sent that day. Usually you want to avoid holidays and weekends, so when your count or your notices, try and avoid that because it creates a bit of a gray area. In this instance, I put it broker to broker, so there's no confusion. So myself representing the buyer and Collier's representing the vendor. Section 12 talks about you can documents by email or fax, and that in good faith over time, you encourage yourself to execute originals. It doesn't all happen. You're typically sending stuff scanned by email, signed. It's still a valid document. Even an email between the parties granting an extension is a valid legal document. It would hold up in court. But it's better to have an actual document. Also, we state that in accordance with the laws of Quebec, which is important because Quebec uses a different code. We use the civil code. The rest of Canada uses common law. I've seen buyers from Ontario try and enforce jurisdiction in their province, but you're doing a transaction here in Quebec. This is a Quebec thing that you need to take the parties that this document was drafted up in English, and you need to identify in French that that was requested by the parties. And then you have the offer, you have to leave it open for a certain date. So a certain time for him to accept the offer. So in this instance, you would put, December 15th by 5 p.m. You identify where he signed it. People sometimes put witnesses. I've been told over the years a witness is not required. However, you do see it on a lot of people's forms. It's fine to have a witness, but I don't use it. I don't think it's required, and we don't need it. So 99% of the time, what happens? This gets submitted, and there's a counter offer. So a lot of people ask me about these delays. A counter offer creates a new delay. So if he counters outside of the acceptance date, doesn't make this offer and the counter offer null and void. The second a counter offer is issued, a new delay is created. And a lot of people don't fully understand that. They feel like, well, the offer was open until December 15th, it's dead. It's only open for acceptance by December 15th. If the vendor counters December 17th, it's a valid legal contract. Now, obviously, you want to work within the delay and respect the December 15th delay for him to accept, and a lot of brokers will call you, well, it's expiring. I'm like, well, look, I need another day, but I'll counter you tomorrow. It's still valid. I don't know if that's the same practice in the other provinces, but
Ryan, in Ottawa, technically, having issues here. Technically, as soon as you make a change to a document, it invalidates the document, right? So
correct.
It's the same as what you're talking about.
I do find a lot of licensed brokers, get a lot of offers from residential brokers, and they'll hold a gun to your head for that delay. When am I hearing back? I'm like, guys, look, if I counter you, I counter you. It's a new delay, so don't worry about the delay you gave me.
Correct. It's out. Yes.
Go ahead.
anyone have any questions? Yeah, this was just perfect timing and very interesting. Ryan, on behalf of Peter Watmore, Sean Hamilton, Andrew Bergen, and myself, we wanted to thank you so much for taking the time to come all the way here, first of all, because Ryan is based in the suburban office, and we are downtown right now. He came out of his way, didn't even hesitate when I asked him to actually present this morning. So again, thank you so much. We really appreciate. And again, if anybody has any questions at any given point in time, Ryan mentioned to me this morning that he's open. The offer could be sent in Word format in case you guys want to play around with it. So don't hesitate to contact Ryan at any given point in time. Thanks, Anne.
Thanks.
That's it. And have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.